Um, okay, everybody, will we get started? So welcome to this webinar this afternoon. It's the first of the School of Education research webinars for the year. We have monthly webinars on the last Thursday of the month, but I forgot that September has only 30 days, so we're the 1st of October. So what we're looking at today is some of the studies that have been carried out in the school and with colleagues across the institution and nationally over the course of the school closures during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're just trying to get a synthesis of some of the research findings to date. And so here we have the speakers for today in the order that we're going to hear them. So we have Colette Murphy, whose area is science education, and she is talking about a study with principals. We have Joanne Banks, whose area is inclusive education, and she's talking about study with post-primary students. Avin Bray, whose area is maths education and 21st century teaching and learning, talking about a teacher and post-primary surveys. There's a link between these surveys. There's myself, Anne Devitt, and my area is language and literacy. I'm talking about a family digital literacy survey with parents. And Erica Piazzoli, finally, our area is arts education, talking about a qualitative study that she has carried out with learners here in Dublin. So just to remind us, as if we need reminding, of the context that we're in at the moment in terms of in Ireland and you know, resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic, just in the education sector specifically. So on the 12th of March, all educational institutions closed for what we thought would be 2 weeks until the 29th of March. But on the 24th of March, parents and teachers and principals, we heard that all the schools were going to stay shut until the 19th of April, and that was their stay-at-home phase of the response to the pandemic. And we thought children might be and young people might be back in school in mid-April. Around the 10th of April, the junior cert exams were cancelled and the leaving certificate was postponed. And at that point, the schools were closed until further notice. And it was likely that they were not going to open for the rest of the school year, as indeed did happen. So on the 8th of May, the leaving cert, the use of calculated grades for the leaving cert was confirmed. And then during the summer, with intensive, following intensive work, obviously, in the Department of Education, a roadmap to reopen the schools was released. And at the end of August, we saw schools, primary and post-primary nationwide, reopening their doors to learners across Ireland. And so while all during this phase of really intensive change and activity in the education system in Ireland, the Department of Education with its associated bodies like the PDST and NEPS and so on were providing guidance around continuity of learning for parents and teachers and principals. There was extensive ongoing CPD, both from the PDST and across a range. I know teachers were engaging in CPD across a range of different, in a range of different ways around distance and blended learning. And then, of course, there was the financial supports for education at the time. The DESH grants were paid early. There was increased ICT funding, and through the summer, then we had there was July provision for children in DESH schools and also for children with disabilities. So that's kind of the Irish context, a bit of a snapshot of what was going on, has been going on for the last 6 months. This is a very tiny slide, if you like, just that is just to capture what some of the impacts of the school closures, some of the literature nationally and internationally seem to be saying about the positive and the negative impacts of school closures. So if we start with the negative, which has very much been to the fore and what we're trying to address in our responses, what has come through nationally and internationally from a whole range of studies is this idea of the digital divide, but where socioeconomic disadvantage is being exacerbated by school closures and by lack of access to digital resources. Children with disabilities are being disproportionately, I suppose, affected by school closures with less access to maybe interventions and resources that they would usually have, and also well-being and mental health being adversely affected by school closures. And that goes for students and teachers. On the positive side, there is very definitely, we've all seen it in action, there's been accelerated digital transformation across the entire education system, and that comes with increased CPD around digital learning, so increased professional development, and just in all ways, infrastructure, professional development, and so on around the digital has just completely exploded at this point. Overall, in Ireland, the findings from a number of studies would suggest that overall there's been consistency and creativity from schools in providing for continuity of learning for students, and also for some learners there has been increase in self-direction and also in engagement for learners who mightn't traditionally perhaps have been engaged in this way with or find it easier to engage from home or digitally with learning. So, we have a picture of positives and negatives, and over the next 5 short inputs, we're going to look at some of the findings from studies in the School of Education. So I'm going to pass first to Colette Murphy to share the findings from her study, hot off the press, not even to be published shortly. So Colette, over to you.
Okay, sorry, thank you very much, Jan. And thank you for everybody watching. I hope you, I don't know about enjoy, but I hope you follow this report that I'm talking about. It's a report of work from working with principals in schools all over Ireland. And there's more than 3,000 primary schools. We focused on primary schools. And of those, we got more than 700 responses to the questionnaire. So our team is Amy Fahy, who is working with me as a research doctoral student, and myself.
Colette, you might want to share your slides. I saw you had some.
Oh, I am. Oh, sorry. Sorry. I'll do it now. I forgot to hit share. Right. Sorry, 1 second. There's always things going on.
Hate not to see all of the work that went into the slides.
Can you see it now?
Yeah, so if you just hit
yeah, good.
Screen show, yeah, perfect, yeah.
Yeah, so that was the first slide, just introducing the team, which is two of us from the School of Education, which is Amy and myself. And then we have Nafu and Ashley Nguyen from, Ashley's from Vietnam, and Nafu is from China initially. And they are from the Trinity Business School. So we were looking at leadership as much as attitudes and experiences and things. We were focusing on leadership. So for the context, as we know, that the COVID-19 pandemic led to school closures, like in most places. And that gave shifting demands for principals. So they were doing all of these 4 little things I'm mentioning. They were working from home, at the same time teaching and caring for children at home and at school, especially the teaching principals. And they were also communicating online with staff and planning for the safe return to school. And they were doing all of those nearly every day. So what we did was we explored their experiences and the impacts as they navigated the first few stages that Anne showed you at the beginning. Our method was a questionnaire, and we developed it not just by a research team, which often happens, but we did it in a more innovative way in that a group of principals were working with us as research advisors so that the questionnaire was more meaningful for them. And then our analysis brought out 2 different areas. One was the outcomes of all this. And that was, we were looking at the principal's well-being, staff adaptivity, school performance, and online teaching adoption. And then the second set of findings relate to the drivers of these outcomes. In other words, the things that make the outcomes more positive or more negative. So first set of findings is about the outcomes. And in this slide at the very top, I hope you can see my little cursor. It's showing you that just the proportion of female principals to male principals, which is 78 to 22%, Whereas, you know, not that many years ago, it was the other way around. Most of my experience was with mostly male principals, especially in primary schools. However, looking at the outcomes of the principals' responses to us, the effect on the principal well-being was highly significant. And if in these three little circles, 77% of them recorded being overwhelmed by the crisis, 71% emotionally exhausted, and nearly 60% isolated and disconnected. That was quite worrying. However, in contrast, the school performance was not adversely affected. All those indicators showed that the principals were happy, that things were happening well. It was more their well-being that was suffering. And they also, another positive was that if you look at these, all 90% plus were their comments on their staff, saying that more than 90% of them were highly skilled. They trusted the principal's leadership and adapted to and sought new ways to solve problems and respond to change. So the principals were very happy with the work of their staff, were happy with the school performance, but the cost was their well-being. So that's the first section. The second is the drivers, the things that's going to help or hinder progress. So the first set of findings were on the drivers were the communication and consultation with the DES, the Department of Education and Skills. The data is here, and the blue columns are kind of negative. So basically, my overall result from that is that the communication was not productive. The second session on the principal's leadership, overall, they found that pretty good, despite the circumstances. Their connections with multiple stakeholders, they were also pretty good. And so they were able to connect with other stakeholders to give them a bit more support. And the attitudes towards online learning during the lockdown was amazing, that it was really, they really embraced it. And their attitudes towards online learning were wholly positive. They thought it was actually effective and pretty easy to use. It said that they could provide effective teaching and assist student learning, efficiency and performance. Oh, I forgot to put my clock on. Anyway, I've only got 1 more minute or so. Some recommendations for the future. What have we learned from this work? And we picked these ones, these three, because they might have broader implications than just principles. So first of all, as the graphic shows you, digital learning and teaching, a child learning from home from the teacher on the computer. And basically, this is actually a very positive development. I think Anne mentioned that earlier as well, of lockdown. However, the principal suggested that we need to, in Ireland especially, improve IT infrastructure and support. Otherwise, it's not going to work, especially for some, and especially those in broadband low areas and in who don't have as much resources. They also ask for much more one-to-one support online by SNAs and special needs assistants and learning support teachers as required. There wasn't enough of that going on. And the final one here, I think, is a very important one that they asked for, and this is because it comes from principals, and it's a brilliant idea, which is to develop online local platforms, local platforms for principals to work together, so that, you know, so many of them would tell us that when something goes wrong, what do I do? Who do I call? So an online platform, which is local to a group of schools, a cluster or a county or an area or whatever. So
just to let you know, Colette, just to have about a bit under a minute.
That's okay. That's number one anyway. I'm just pointing that one out because it's really important and broadens. The second was the provision of professional development opportunities. The principals were saying they'd like some leadership and crisis management training, and they want more attention on shared and distributed leadership, and for that they need team building training. And very finally, the improved communication and greater involvement of principals is something that is a recommendation, so that principals are more involved in networks so that they can eventually improve policy as well. That's me finished. Thank you. Bye.
Perfect timing there, Colette. Thanks very
Good.
much.
Thank you. I was terrified that you just switched me off, you see.
So I'm going to ask Joanne Banks to take over from this. So if you can stop sharing your screen there, Colette, and we'll move on to...
Stop, yeah, done.
And we'll move on to Joanne Banks. Over to you. You're on mute, Joanne, by the way.
After all of these months, still not knowing to unmute yourself. Just bear with me. And can I just double check you can see and hear okay there, yeah? You're on mute yourself.
We can see the two slides, your view, you know what I mean?
Yeah, so I'll just go out of it again if you don't mind.
Sure.
Did I do it again?
Perfect.
Perfect. Nice one. Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome. It's great to see so many people here today and interested in this topic of huge relevance. And I think you'll find that a lot of what I'm about to say and what the following presentations are about to say really align with what Colette has just said. So I'm just going to introduce, for those of you that don't know, myself and colleagues in the School of Education and Trinity Access have been busy this summer, and we produced a series of reports all relating to education and COVID. And I think we touch on each of these reports within the next 3 presentations anyway. The first report was on teacher perspectives of teaching and learning during lockdown, during school closures. The second was using parent data, and we got a lovely insight into the parent perspectives of their experiences of education at home. And then finally, we used really rich student data to look at what it was like for the students themselves. And that's what I'm going to focus on in my presentation today. So the general emphasis in this presentation is to look at the student mental health and well-being and their overall engagement during lockdown, and just what their experiences were like during that period, and just see how it could feed into policy development into the future. So the data that we used for this was based on just over 1,000 second level schools in 15 Trinity Access, over 1,000 students in 15 Trinity Access linked schools, and they were geographically spread within the broader Dublin area. And what we did was we used the Trinity Access have a longitudinal study, and they were due to go into the field during lockdown, and much of the survey that they were due to go out and remained the same, but a number of questions were modified at the end to reflect the change in circumstances and to try and capture their experiences of COVID. So it was a self-reported survey. They used Qualtrics. It took them about 20 to 25 minutes, and they were asked about their background, kind of demographic characteristics, things like that, but their attitudes and experiences of teaching and learning during lockdown. So well-being, for those of you that work in this area, it's quite a contested term, but we used a scale, the Short Work Edinburgh Mental Health and Wellbeing Scale, which relates to what's known as students' affective and behavioural mental well-being. And this simply asks students to report their feelings during the previous 2 weeks. So in relation to a pandemic, it's quite an important time to capture this kind of information. I'll just briefly go over, there's been a number of research reports carried out on the student perspective in recent months, both in Ireland and internationally. And I'm just giving you some of the findings of 2 reports here. The findings show that 40%, in one study showed that 40% did not enjoy schooling at home. As a parent, I can really vouch for that. I don't think I enjoyed it very much either. Half of the students surveyed said the schooling at home, though, had a negative effect on their mental health. And this is not surprising. They missed their friends, they missed the buzz of the classroom, and they found it difficult to engage with one another. And from the research area that I come from, it's also not surprising that children with disabilities were particularly susceptible to poor mental health during this period of being at home and perhaps feeling greater isolation from school. I just briefly go over the policy. There's been a number of initiatives by the government since the school closures to address mental health and wellbeing of young people. They announced the introduction of 120 new guidance posts. They did a designated back to school website giving information to principals and teachers about how to handle students if they did present with mental health difficulties. The Health Service Executive has a number of documents about students, a lot of them around the exams and the cancellation of exams, but just how to cope with their mental health during this strange pandemic period. And then other organisations like Jigsaw had some really good documents available, but also live chats and video links and things for young people to link into if they wished. So I'll just briefly move on to the findings. So we found a decline in student mental health and well-being over time, and we were able to compare the results of the 2019 Trinity Access survey with the 2020 ones, and this was a small effect but statistically significant. The qualitative responses from students were quite insightful as well. Online schooling has been more difficult for me, has led to a lot of stress. The student acknowledges that it's needed at the moment, but it has not been effective for me in any way, and it's been a big change and I wasn't able to cope with it, another student reported. So we wanted to find out what the reason for this, why was it not working for them? And the vast majority of students said the stress was due to what they perceived to be an increased workload from school when they were learning at home. 4 out of 5 students reported that their workload increased during this time, and many found it difficult to manage, and it increased and impacted on their stress levels. So these are some quotations that I think represent this quite well. I think the workload amount has increased exponentially, has put a lot of unneeded stress on me. And this person goes on to say that their friends and peers agree. And also I think this is quite a telling quotation, that they felt that the teachers are busier and less responsive. It's a lot more work to do and deadlines met at the same time from 8 separate subjects. So where we noticed that there wasn't joined up thinking or kind of a collaborative approach being used in schools, the students were being inundated with different deadlines, often at the same time, causing stress. So we then highlighted what worked, what helped maintain student mental health and increase engagement. So we found that where there was a positive online community established, so where students felt that they were part of a school community, that were all learning online. So there's more communication now between teachers and students, this student says. It makes work easier because you can see the questions that people are asking, and obviously their own questions are being answered in that way. It's like a big team online, the student suggests. Another student pointed out it's where there was a two-way communication between them at home and their families and the school, where school leaders and teachers listened. So this student complained that they were stressed about the level of workload, but that their teachers and principals listened and changed the workload to 1 piece of work a week from each subject to help relieve the students of their stress. So
just to let you know, there's about 2 minutes left there, Joanne.
No bother, thanks, Anne. So I also thought I should highlight what didn't work, and it's the opposite to what I just said. So it's where students felt that they had little or no feedback on work that they submitted. So they felt that they were doing work and it wasn't being properly reviewed or been given feedback by their teachers. And also the survey would show that the lack of peer relations and connectivity and lack of collaboration with their own peers in their learning was also what didn't work. And again, not surprisingly from education research pre-COVID, negative relations with teachers has a detrimental effect on students' mental health, but also on engagement. The student has been suffering insomnia, depression, anxiety, and all I get is given out to for not having work done. So you can see a big disconnect between them and that particular teacher. So I'm just going to finish with these 2 slides as to what we can do. And again, this really overlaps nicely with what Colette's findings show. So we should support school leaders. The research suggests that the school leaders should be supported in how to identify mental health difficulties such as stress and anxiety amongst their students, to help principals support their staff, but also support parents who come to them with issues around student mental health, to really support, to source appropriate help and supports in these unusual times. And I think our reports really emphasize that these are important now, but they're also important just for general education in our education system, that these supports are readily available for people in charge, like school principals. And secondly, to support school teachers. And there's a huge emphasis on CPD in nearly all of the reports that we published. So an increased awareness amongst teachers of the types of CPD available, such as what's given by the PDST on how to promote good mental health and well-being, but also the teachers might use this time while they're back in the classroom to check in on students about how they're doing and how their mental health and well-being is, and to gather information from students as to what worked and what didn't work during school closures, if God forbid we ever have to go back to school closures in the future. And that's me done. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks a million, Joanne. So I'm going to hand over to Aveen Bray now. Aveen, if you share your slides, and great, we're keeping to good time here. You're on mute, Aveen.
Yeah, crikey. You'd think by now that we'd know how to at least do that. Sorry about that, everybody. Okay, so I'll move straight on then. What I was focusing on was the teaching and learning for the development of key skills, and looking at that in the context of the school closures. But before I go into what happened during school closures, I think it's important just to highlight what we mean by key skills. And I'd say most people are aware of the Irish understanding of key skills as being the junior cycle key skills. And what I've done in order to do this work was we've aligned a particular instrument that we've developed that can measure students' experiences and confidence with each of these skills in terms of creativity, collaboration, communication, self-direction and critical thinking. And one other then that sort of captures the use of technology for learning across all of the skills. So it doesn't tap into every single one of the junior cycle skills, but when I talk about key skills, these are the ones that I mean. And then if we want to think about why we need to focus on key skills, and I think this goes, Joanne has already introduced this idea of the longitudinal study that I've been working on with Trinity Access over the last couple of years. And what we found in the first tranche of data collection in 2019, where we had nearly 4,000 student responses, was that teaching and learning that focused on the development of key skills was the most significant predictor of the higher levels of active engagement with education, positive student well-being, and better relationships between students and teachers. So for that reason, we feel that it's really important to put a focus on the development of key skills. It's already built into the curriculum, but there's not always an understanding of why it's important. So what happened then during COVID-19? Well, as Joanne mentioned, we did 2 surveys, one with students, which I don't think I need to describe because she went into great detail there. And we also got responses from 723 post-primary teachers from 102 schools across Ireland. And that gave us a really nice coverage of different types of schools and allowed us to make some comparisons between single sex and co-ed, DESH and non-DESH and so on. And that's been really informative for the results and for our recommendations. So when we were looking at the teacher data, we used a framework called Universal Design for Learning, and I'm sure some of you are very familiar with this approach. And it highlights particular principles that teachers should look to develop in order to help their students access, build, and internalize learning. And what we did was we mapped those principles to the key skills in order to allow us to see what way teachers were working with their students in the online environment. And one of the really positive things was that the teachers tended to be using much more creative ways of communicating with their students and allowing their students to communicate with them and represent their work in different ways. And this had a really positive impact. As this teacher notes, some students who would really struggle in school have shown themselves to be very creative and talented when given a different medium or more options to express themselves and present their work. However, the collaborative aspect of the learning online diminished quite significantly for a large proportion of those teachers, with 51% of teachers reporting a drop in their ability to foster collaboration with their students or between their students. And again, this was noted as being something negative, with this teacher saying that there was a feeling of loss of control over student development, but also of routine, friendship and collaboration that is inherent in a school environment. And one of the things that was quite interesting was that there was a difference between the predictors of engagement in DESH and non-DESH schools, in that it was the provision of feedback in DESH schools was highly associated with higher levels of engagement by the students with the learning online. So there was that need for the communication and collaboration and engagement with assessment practices for that particular cohort of students. But overall, we noted that a lack of contact and collaborative activity had a negative impact on the teachers' perceived levels of student engagement during the closures. If we move then to the student experiences, so looking at that student data from the over 1,000 students in the Trinity Access linked schools, it's very clear to see that they found that the types of activities that were in relation to collaboration had decreased very significantly, with 79% of those students reporting a decrease in that type of activity, while the technology usage for education had not surprisingly increased for the majority of students. Another interesting thing that we found was that self-direction there was a majority of students who said that self-direction activities that encourage their ability to direct their own learning and manage their own learning had increased. So there were some negatives and some positives coming out of this data as well. So one student was saying they were extremely stressed at the beginning because of the increase in workload, but that they actually found that ability to direct their own learning and manage themselves to make it easier. So it's a really strong and really important skill to be noted that's coming out of the lockdown experience. The negativity of the lack of collaboration and the lack of connection between students was also noted, however, with the one student saying they couldn't see their friends or hold a proper conversation, which made the student upset and angry and made it harder for them to learn. And another one noting that they felt like the work had increased and it's harder because they don't usually work by themselves, which in itself is a really nice thing to see, that they're obviously in a school that is supporting this collaborative approach to learning, but that didn't translate into the online environment. So once we looked at the impact of these changes in teaching and learning, we used a multi-level binary logistic regression model, which was something I hadn't done before. So I managed to learn an awful lot myself during lockdown.
Just let you know, Abby, there's about 2 minutes left.
Perfect. Thanks, Anne. It allowed us to identify the predictors of low levels of engagement, or what were the factors that were most influential on student engagement. And what we found was that exposure to teaching and learning practices that supported the development of key skills was a significant predictor of the level of active engagement with education, and also of the quality of the student-teacher relationship. So those students who felt that they had a good relationship with their teachers, that was predicted by their engagement with this type of teaching and learning. And while it didn't directly predict higher well-being, that those two, active engagement with education and better student-teacher relationships, were predictive of higher levels of student well-being. So you can see there that there is a sort of a trickle-down effect that's really important, and that we really should be supporting the development of these skills. So in terms of the recommendations then, I think first of all, we need to acknowledge the really amazing work and the developments that have come out of this experience, that there is an increased creativity and diversity of communication from teachers in supporting their students in their ability to access, build and internalize learning. And that's something that should be capitalized on and developed. And that we need to provide more opportunities for students to communicate and collaborate in their online, blended or socially distant environment. So one of the things that's come out since schools have gone back is that it's very difficult to encourage collaboration because the students are distant. So we need to find ways to actually support that. Some of the things that have been already done to facilitate this are the amazing resources that have been developed and are available online on the PDST and JCT websites. And we need to just make sure that the teachers are fully aware of these resources. And then secondly, we need to prioritize professional development that that support assessment for learning approaches, where those students can capitalize that on that self-direction, but they need to be supported in doing that. And additionally, to support the collaborative work in the online and socially distanced environment. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm going to hand back. I'll stop sharing now. Thank you very much. And hand back to Anne.
Thanks, Aveen. And I think I'm just about just going to share my screen here. So it's over to me now. Just give me 1 second. Here we go. Share. So let's go. Sorry, just trying to get that. Yeah. Okay. So hopefully that's okay. So yeah, what I'm going to focus on is a study. It's again a survey, a survey with parents, but it's part of a larger study. I'll talk about that in a moment. So it's basically looking at the home learning environment that parents of primary school children were engaging with over the last 6 months. And as a parent of primary school children, I know how hard it was. So this particular study was part of a broader study that's funded by the Irish Research Council and is in partnership with NALA. So it's around family digital literacy. So the goal of the project, which started last September, was to look at using technology to support family digital literacy practices. So that's practices that support literacy development in the home, but in particular for families where the parents might have or the guardians might have unmet literacy learning needs. And the focus for the project was very much on a family learning program, something that might take place in schools and be mediated by technology. But of course, in March of this year, when we were supposed to be going out on a need-finding survey to schools that we've been engaging with, the schools all closed, and we decided to essentially pivot the activity of the project towards looking at home learning and seeing what we could do to support activity in the home. So the survey that we had planned was focusing on family digital literacy practices and access to devices in the home. And we added to that or modified that to adapt it for the homeschooling or home learning context. So looking at sorry, I just forgot to set my timer. I'm setting it there now for myself. That we had to look at the home learning context and looking at school communications and so on around home learning. So the survey was designed drawing on a number of instruments, in particular the Book Trust questionnaire from the UK, and a range of instruments to pull together a view of family literacy practices. The steering group for the project did absolutely stupendous work in supporting the design and the piloting of the survey. And most importantly, we aimed to get to bring in as many parents with who might normally not access these kinds of surveys into the to engage with those parents as part of this. So the questionnaire was piloted a number of times with the support of the steering group, but with parents from, I suppose, marginalized groups and parents with unmet literacy learning needs. And it was deployed nationally by Amoric Research, but it was targeted specifically, in addition, we targeted specifically parents with unmet literacy learning needs. So we tried to get a broad view of parents in order to not be just getting the view of kind of the middle ground. So the main research questions for this study were to look at what family learning practices were happening during school closures. In particular, we wanted to see what were the supports and communications and activities and resources and so on that were most helpful in supporting parents and children with home learning, and what factors impacted on children's continuity of learning from their parents' perspectives. And so I suppose the main question that we looked at, I'm going to ask you, by the way, to have the chat, the little chat tool ready, because I'm going to ask you a question in a minute. So during school closures, we asked parents how confident they felt in, we asked them how confident they felt about their child continuing to learn, and we also asked them about how confident they felt in helping their child to learn. So the majority of parents felt pretty confident that their children were continuing to learn, but about a quarter of them didn't. And on this graph here, we have that the majority of parents also felt able, quite able to support their children's learning during during the school closures, but again, a significant portion did not. So the question that I have for you is to see, what do you think was the main reason that people cited as being why parents did not feel confident to help their kids learn? Was it because they didn't have enough time? A. Was it because they didn't know the curriculum? B. Or C, because they didn't have what they needed at home? So can I ask you to type in there? I've got one saying A. Any others? A's and B's? A, a lot of A's, few B's. Yeah, good few B's. Yeah. So you've got the, and a couple of C's there, yeah. So you've got the picture more or less right. I think when I came to do the survey, or when not, I didn't do the survey, when I was designing the survey, I was thinking, oh my God, everyone's going to be saying they don't have the time. But actually the number one reason that people didn't feel confident to support their children was because they didn't know the curriculum. So second to that certainly was that they didn't have the time to help. And after that, interestingly, even where they did maybe know the curriculum, they didn't know what was important for the child to focus on at that particular time. And a range of other reasons too, around stress and having other commitments and so on. But very definitely that focus on knowing the curriculum was really, really important. And here's what some of the parents said, kind of in the qualitative responses as part of this survey. So I'm well educated and understand the curriculum, and English is my first language. For those who are not born in Ireland, I can imagine it's very difficult. So some people feeling very well positioned to support their children. So another parent saying, if we had a better understanding of exactly what the curriculum contains, we could move forward faster and stop him being bored over subjects he already knows. So that targeting to the individual child is very important as to what's important for that child at that time. And then we've other, and I'm sure we'll all feel for this, other parents' experiences. I do my best, but my kids play up and the school environment is more structured. So that knowledge of how to structure the learning is very difficult for parents. And then finally, parents saying, I try to go through reading and charts and so on, but I lose patience after 30 minutes and it's unfair on my son and me. And I think we all have come to realize the extensive, I mean, not that we would have, many of us would have known it already, but just the value of the teacher's knowledge in supporting and structuring learning, and that structured environment is not something that's easy to replicate at home, and maybe not something that's desirable to replicate at home either. So that we also asked the parents what it was most useful for, what had been most useful for them to help their kids learn. And the number one is the adults in the household more than anything else. The adults and the materials in the house. So this part about the materials is very important because some of the parents commented on how useful a pack of materials would have been, and certainly in some DESH contexts these materials were being made available. But just that access to those tools that you need for learning in terms of even pencils and crayons is very valuable. Digital media and devices were important, but not as much as the parents and the other kind of physical things in the home. So when we looked at how confident the parents were in saying that their children were continuing to learn, so in being asked whether their child was continuing to learn or not, the main predictors of this were things that in some ways they were quite surprising. So one of the main predictors of this was the quality and the area of focus of communication from the school. So things like school communications, which covered a range of areas, so not just focused on providing work, communication that provided feedback, and communication also across a broad range of people. So this certainly might not necessarily be the case for all, or might not necessarily be possible in all schools, but where parents had contact with multiple people in the school, the class teacher perhaps, the homeschool liaison, and or the special needs coordinator or whatever, and the principal also, this was very positive in predicting continuity of learning. Another key factor there, which we've already looked at, is the parental confidence, how confident the parent felt in supporting their child. So in order, of course, to increase confidence, it seems like we have to address their knowledge around the curriculum, seeing as we can't, of course, increase their time. And another key predictor was the parental engagement in family learning practices. And so I suppose, sorry, just to keep to time here, some of the things that we've learned from this, some of the recommendations for school coming out of this are that, the need in a home learning context, but also more broadly, study, the need to broaden the scope of communications beyond just focusing on work, the need to prioritize communication that's focused on the learning goals for specific, for the specific child, and of course the need to provide feedback to learners. In terms of the policy recommendations, the key elements are prioritizing CPD around this type of quality communication and perhaps providing supports for that in plain English and with, good visual guidelines, and also supporting family learning programs and resources in the home. So those are some of the key elements from the study. There's broader things around family digital literacy practices that we are working through at the moment. So I'll just stop sharing here, and I'm going to hand over to Erica to share the last study of the session, which is around, which she'll introduce now.
Thanks, Anne. And good afternoon, everyone. Thumbs up if you can see the screen. Great. Just put on slideshow. Okay, so we're going to shift gear now, and we'll go from a macro perspective to a micro perspective of some experiences of student life during lockdown in Ireland. And just to give a bit of context about this project, Inside, Outside and Beyond is the title, and the project is nested within a larger Irish Research Council research on performative language learning and motivation to belong and belonging. The project is in partnership with YES for Youth and Education Service for Refugees and Migrants, and that is a service of the City of Dublin ETB. So just before lockdown in March 2020, we were up and running with the Surgente project, this project I just mentioned. We had finished observations, and we were just about to start with some performative arts workshops that were going to gauge the performative language learning and research of young teenagers, refugees and asylum seekers enrolled in the Migrant Access Program as part of the YES service. And at that point we had to stop and pause, because like everyone else, there was a moment of complete lockdown. And after the first few months, we realized that all education had shifted online, and it would be very interesting to touch base with the students again and to find out what was their experience of living in lockdown in Ireland. Also the project was conceived as part of the Living in Lockdown archives of the Trinity community. So just briefly mention the team here, myself, Dr. Garrett Scully, whom I believe is online. Hi, Garrett. Rachel Jacobs and Kathleen Werner-Yates. So our aim was to examine whether and how the lockdown restrictions have rewritten the boundaries of inclusion and exclusion and perceived sense of belonging in young refugees and migrants recently arrived in Dublin and attending the Migrant Access Program. Our question in particular was, how did the lockdown in Ireland affect refugee students' sense of belonging and motivation to speak English? In terms of participants, we had participated 10 young students from 16 to 18, so very much teenagers, enrolled in the Access Program run by Youth and Education Services, like I said before. And what I'm going to present is an arts-based case study, so a qualitative case study where we use digital storytelling workshops delivered daily over 2 weeks in July, and they were followed by one-on-one interviews. So both workshops and interviews, in terms of methods, availed of arts-based research methods to elicit memories during lockdown, and some of the methods were drawing, storytelling, mime, singing, photography, as well as film. I'm going to share just 3 examples of some of these methods with participants. And the first story I would like to share is about a young fellow called Farid. All names are pseudonyms, by the way. So Farid is originally from Syria, and he was really keen to participate in the stories, but wasn't quite sure how to tell a story or what story to tell. So we, in the interview, we engaged in this game that we had done in the workshops related to guessing an object while you draw. So I started to draw something, and Farid had to guess what it was. And while he was guessing that, then a story emerged, and I'm going to read what he said. So when lockdown hit in Ireland, Farid had just arrived after a 1.5-year wait in Greece, fleeing from Syria, during which he lost hope several times about ever making it to Ireland. But he didn't give up, he said, because he was always in contact with, quote, the Irish Association, which was reassuring he would make it, and he did. When he finally arrived in Ireland, then lockdown started. They brought him strawberries, fresh strawberries, every day during lockdown. He was so bored inside, having to self-isolate, but the strawberries tasted good. And so when I asked him, what was it like for you to taste your first strawberry in Ireland after all that time waiting, 1.5 years waiting in Greece for this to happen? He answered, not giving up, exciting. My story may be titled, My First Strawberry, I'm in Ireland. So just the drawing exercise for Farid was the trigger to then start recalling the whole waiting experience, and the strawberry in itself became almost a symbol of his not giving up, in his own words. The second participant I'd like to share is a lovely, bubbly young girl, we'll call her Greta, and she took pictures during lockdown of her Irish neighborhood during spring and summer in Ireland. And she really focused on the same landscape, but how it changed through the seasons, and she was impressed by the fact that it was very empty because nobody was around. While recollecting experiences related to walking in a neighborhood, and in particular in an empty neighborhood, there was a memory that she shared with us that was triggered by this. And this is a sketch. We couldn't take photographs for GDPR reasons, but we had an artist that sketched live some of the participants. And this is a particular moment where Greta is telling us this story about how she got lost and then finally she was found again. Now, in the story that she shared, again, I'm going to read it. She got lost in her neighborhood in Albania, and there are no streets in her neighborhood, but you know where someone lives from the name of your grandfather. She got lost while doing trick or treat around with her little cousin, who was 7, in a Halloween-like celebration. They were walking alongside railways at dusk to find their way back, but they were still lost. So eventually they were found by an old lady who knew her grandfather and took them home. Her grandparents gave the old lady a family handkerchief as a thank you token. So again, this story was triggered when she was experiencing lockdown in Ireland. She remembered about this. Finally, Latifa, a bubbly, lovely lady from Guinea, who had arrived in Ireland 6 months prior to lockdown. Now, during lockdown, she spent a lot of time on her English-French dictionary, and she was living with an Irish family. She said she spoke a lot of English during lockdown because she was always with the family. And in fact, she couldn't see her peers so often as she usually would at the access program. So the lockdown experience for her helped her to feel a little bit more Irish, especially because her host family, they were an older couple with grandparents, but they couldn't see their Irish grandchildren. And so she became the granddaughter. In a way, she felt she was really nourished and cuddled in this family, and she really embraced the Irish culture, she was saying. Also, I would like to add that a particular situation in Ireland for our research context was that most of our participants were living either in direct provision or in emergency accommodation just before COVID-19. But because during the lockdown, a lot of Airbnb apartments were empty because there was no tourism, they were able to move into Airbnb apartments. So for some of them, it was the first time that they actually lived in an apartment in Ireland. So that was a really cool experience for them, which they reported. Back to Latifa. Latifa reported she listened to a lot of music during lockdown, that she loved singing. And she wanted to share a song with us. And in order to honor her voice, I would like to share a little bit of her song with you.
J'ai fait tant de vies, j'ai fait tant de pays, rencontré tant de filles qui ont partagé ma vie. J'ai pas trouvé l'amour quand j'étais rencontré. L'amour a vu le jour. J'ai fait le tour du monde pour trouver la plus belle.
So that was her voice sharing her favorite song that she listened to and sang during lockdown. The first few lines are, I've seen so many cities, I've seen so many countries, and definitely they take a completely different meaning in her mouth. So just some preliminary findings here. All participants mentioned feeling isolated from their peers and missing face-to-face contact. However, they also found that the lockdown experience brought them closer to the Irish local culture. COVID-19 and the coronavirus doesn't really differentiate between doesn't really care about the color of the skin or doesn't discriminate. So we found in this particular situation it was rewriting boundaries and rediscovering local communities for some of our participants. Also, and you mentioned at the beginning the digital divide, and definitely we did find that this was a significant finding for our participants because most of them had issues with accessing equipment and accessing technology. So that sometimes compromised their experience of online education and indeed connecting with the workshops. So that's all from my part, and back to you, Anne. Thank you.
Okay, thanks to all the participants for some really interesting input there. I'll open it to the floor. We just had the kind of summarizing things. I suppose we went from the very macro down to the micro here, and we ended up with the lovely, really particular thing there with Erica, getting the voice of one of the people in lockdown. It's just lovely. So we're really trying to get a full view of things. But I suppose some of the key points that are coming up for us have been, first of all, the importance and the value of the human connection, that we absolutely feel it, we know we need it, and how important that is for learning and for well-being. The real value of that sense of togetherness, and we're all in this together, for that collaborative activity that's come through in all of the kind of school-based work, the value of collaboration to achieve goals, and also for the students. And also, I suppose, the opportunities and the challenges of the digital. So the opportunities around collaboration and around use of multiple media, providing feedback and for family learning, and the challenges where there are limits to accessing that. We've all probably experienced the challenges of actually using it. I do have my mic on now, I hope. We are kind of at 2 minutes to 5. So if anyone has any questions, we answered a couple of questions, I think, in the Q&A, but if anyone has any questions they want to put in the Q&A or even in the chat, that's fine. Or if you want to...
I think David Duffy had a question there in the chat earlier, which I might be able to address to some extent here. It was, if we do, God forbid, have to go into another lockdown, what would be the main piece of advice? And I think you made some really nice points there, David, about the teachers and the school leaders really keeping the schools afloat and managing extremely well. But I think what we felt, having done the piece of research with the 3 different cohorts, was the main thing that came out across all of them was a whole school approach, where everybody communicates as much as they can with everybody else and listens to everybody else. So the students need to feel that their voice is heard, the teachers need to feel that their voice is heard, and I think, coming from Colette as well, the principals need to have somebody to have as a sounding board as well. So I think that idea of communication and collaboration and that kind of listening to each other and having a whole school approach would be my feeling of the most important takeaway, probably. I don't know if anybody else would like to come in on that.
Go ahead, Colette. You're on mute.
Thank you, Aveen. I agree fully. And the thing that government usually likes to do to fix is throw money at it. I wish they'd just throw people instead, because the worry is, like, what they did was to supply these devices to schools all over the place, to kids and what have you, at home, at school. And most of them had no idea how to use them. And most of the families had no idea how to use these devices. And so it's this whole idea that if there were, I mentioned the local platforms, and if they could be financed in some way to be able to work with principals and teachers children, parents, whatever. And the other thing I just wanted to point out about communication, which is one of my PhD students worked with me on trying to develop different relationships between school and home. And one of the things that we used with our schools, this was when I was in the north, working in the north, and Andrea was working with a school of the equivalent of a DESH school. And most of the parents couldn't speak English or were illiterate and would never come near the school. They were scared. And the other thing was that some of them we picked up that the information only went from school to home. And so what we did in the part of the project, we gave them scrapbooks. And so parents could put in pictures, they could put in also more digital things if they had. They could make we gave them all video cameras. We were videoing play between parents and young children. And this business that the school received feedback on their work, because the school sent their little assessments and the children's work home, and then the parents were able to work with that and send stuff back. And the schools were saying, this is amazing. And, you know, it's not often thought of, but this idea that the parents also continue, you know, communicate to the school, and it's not just one way.
Yeah, certainly. I think that the one thing that comes through here is very definitely about the power of communication and the power of the human contact. And Vivian asked, Vivian Rath there, it's a question around schools creating a sense of belonging for disabled students who may not be able to rejoin their classes. Joanne, is that you with your hand up to respond?
Yeah, thanks for that, Vivian. It's a really, really good point, and it's probably has not received any kind of coverage at all as the students who simply haven't been able to rejoin yet. What we did find in the studies was for students with disabilities that Anne mentioned it earlier on, where there was kind of multiple sources of contact in the school, engagement was much higher. So where there was the school principal, teacher, if there was an SNA present or a homeschool liaison, that the kind of multiple channels from to and from the school, from the home to the school, was really, really important in improving engagement, but also the regularity of contact. So I think now that schools are back, and if there's students with disabilities who can't rejoin their class, it's a perfect opportunity to bring the class to home and to have regular contact so the student feels part of a community. And like, there's no reason why learning can't take place in that space. It doesn't have to just be social contact, it can be an academic context as well. I'd love to hear your own views on that sometime as well. Thanks, Vivian.
So I'm conscious here now that it's a couple of minutes past 3, and I really appreciate you all engaging with the webinar. We're delighted to share the research with you. A couple of people have asked about the recording. The recording will be available afterwards, and a number of people were looking for the list of resources. So I know in the question and answer we put in some responses, but in the recording we'll put a slide maybe to the start or to the end, just about, you know, people are asking about where to access the JCT and resources or the digital learning resources and so on. So we'll put a slide in there that has a link to those things. So thanks very much to all of you, and I hope you have a lovely evening ahead, relaxation. And looking forward to talking to you again in the future.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
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 Bye.